I never thought I would see this day. I whispered to myself as I held the envelope in my hands, the corner worn as if it had traveled miles to reach me. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, cutting across the wooden floor in thin lines that did little to warm the room. The anniversary card for Edward sat untouched on the counter, a reminder of a lifetime shared, decades of mornings just like this one, filled with the quiet routines that had come to define us. I set the envelope down slowly, careful not to disturb its contents, and moved to the living room where the faded armchair waited, its cushions molded to the shape of countless afternoons spent reading, sipping tea, and sharing moments that were ours alone. My hands lingered on the edge of the mantel, fingers tracing the familiar carvings where Edward had once rested his hand, a silent gesture of comfort that now seemed impossibly distant. The envelope seemed heavier in that space, its presence amplifying a sense of unease I could not yet name. I opened it with deliberate care, peeling back the flap and sliding out the photographs within. They were clear, crisp, and utterly shocking. Edward stood with Victoria in a small park near downtown, both smiling at the camera, caught in what appeared to be a moment of private amusement. My heart sank, not from anger, but from a cold, sinking realization that things were not as they seemed, that my carefully ordered life had quietly harbored deception. I set the photos on the coffee table, arranging them without thought, noticing the slight tremor in my hands, though I did not allow it to show. The air in the room felt thick, as if it, too, held its breath, waiting. I walked to the window and looked out at the familiar neighborhood street, the maple trees just beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. The sight should have brought calm, but it only deepened the surreal feeling, as though I were watching the world through a pane of glass that had shifted, tilting slightly, and revealing angles I had never considered. My mind raced through the past weeks, months, even years, searching for signs I might have missed. The brief absences, the hurried phone calls, the glances that seemed slightly off, but I dismissed them, attributing them to the normal ebb and flow of a family life, to Edward's work, to Victoria's routines. Now, seeing the photographs, those explanations felt inadequate, hollow. I returned to the armchair and sat, folding my hands over the envelope and the photographs, feeling the weight settle into my lap as if it were more than paper, as if it carried the cumulative gravity of choices, secrets, and truths withheld. I thought of the small gestures Edward had always made, the way he had left notes in the kitchen, the way he had remembered to tuck my favorite sweater over the back of the chair before a chilly morning. Those details, once comforting, now carried the bitter tang of irony, highlighting what I had been blind to, what I had allowed to slip by unnoticed. The room remained silent except for the occasional hum of a passing car outside, a sound that had always been background to our lives, now oddly intrusive. I looked down at the images again, noting the way Victoria laughed, her posture relaxed, a sharp contrast to the composed, deliberate demeanor she usually maintained in our home. The sight stung, but not in a way that demanded outward reaction. I breathed deeply, allowing the initial shock to settle, letting my mind catalog the evidence, prepare itself for what would come next. I reminded myself that control was subtle, not always loud, that presence and observation could carry more weight than immediate confrontation. I placed the photographs back on the table, stacking them neatly, as I had seen Edward do with letters years before, with care and purpose. The envelope lay beside them, a small, unassuming container for a revelation that could have unraveled me if I had allowed it. Instead, I felt a strange steadiness, a quiet clarity that edged along my nerves, sharpening my thoughts without breaking them. I stood and moved through the house, noting each familiar sight with renewed attention, the framed photos, the polished surfaces, the faint scent of lavender from a diffuser Edward had always favored. Each element of the home seemed to assert a continuity, a reminder that while one aspect of my world had shifted, the foundation of my life, my perspective, my resolve, remained intact. I returned to the living room, seating myself once more, and let the sunlight play across the photographs, catching the edges, illuminating the faces, highlighting the subtle cues I had not noticed before. I understood, in that quiet, unspoken way, that the day, meant to celebrate years of shared life, had become the catalyst for a deeper awareness, an awakening to the truths that had lingered beneath the surface. I did not react with anger, nor with accusations. I simply observed, cataloged, and planned in the stillness of my living room, allowing the shock to settle into a composed determination, feeling the weight of the envelope, the photographs, and the unspoken story they contained, a story that I would navigate carefully, with measured steps and deliberate action, each choice considered before the first words were ever spoken. The afternoon sun fell gently through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the living room floor. Margaret sat quietly on the edge of her sofa, her hands resting lightly on her knees, staring at the photographs again. Each image seemed to hold a story she was only beginning to understand, fragments of a reality that had been quietly unfolding behind her back. The room was still except for the faint ticking of the antique wall clock, a sound that normally brought comfort, now emphasizing the silence that had settled around her. She noticed the stack of mail she had left unopened on the side table, the letters and envelopes representing ordinary life, mundane concerns that now felt disconnected from the weight of what she had just discovered. Margaret rose slowly and moved to the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of chamomile tea. The steam curled in the sunlight, momentarily softening the edges of the morning, and she took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread through her hands and up to her chest. She allowed herself to breathe, to center, to regain composure, though the unease lingered just beneath the surface. Her mind traced back over the last few weeks, the small signs she had dismissed: Edward staying late at the office more often, Victoria's sudden interest in household projects that had nothing to do with her own responsibilities, the vague excuses, the hurried conversations that stopped when she entered the room. They had all seemed harmless, ordinary even, until now. Margaret walked slowly through the living room, her fingers brushing the spines of the books on the shelves, the familiar textures grounding her as she allowed the images to replay in her mind. She reflected on the morning rituals she had shared with Edward, the way he would always place his coffee cup precisely where it belonged, the subtle nods of acknowledgement they exchanged over small domestic victories, and the quiet conversations over dinner. Each memory now carried a tinge of irony, highlighting the contrast between past intimacy and present deception. The envelope and photographs lay on the coffee table, a silent challenge, inviting her to examine, to question, to understand. She returned to the sofa, sliding the photos back into their careful arrangement, taking note of details she had overlooked before: the tilt of Edward's head, the relaxed posture of Victoria, the setting that suggested familiarity rather than chance encounter. Margaret allowed herself a faint tightening of the jaw, a recognition that her family life had been quietly shifting, that what she had trusted and taken for granted required a more discerning eye. She considered the practicalities, the logistics, the conversations that might follow, weighing each thought with deliberate care. The familiar sounds of her home, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards as she shifted, reminded her that life carried on, mundane yet significant, and that she had the capacity to navigate this revelation with clarity and purpose. Margaret focused on the small, intentional actions she could take, organizing the photographs, making notes, preparing herself mentally for conversations that would inevitably arise. She felt the pull of memory and observation intertwined, each informing the other, providing a path forward through the confusion and quiet turmoil. The light shifted as the sun moved across the room, highlighting the textures of her surroundings, the photographs, the books, the simple furnishings that had shaped her daily life. Margaret sat with patience and resolve, the quiet of the afternoon allowing her mind to untangle the strands of evidence, to consider the intentions behind actions, to plan a measured approach. She was calm, attentive, aware, and she let that awareness guide her, preparing not for confrontation, but for understanding and deliberate response, each thought measured and each decision anchored in careful observation of the truth she now held. Margaret moved to the dining room and set the table for two, the familiar china cups arranged with precision, each placement a small act of control in the midst of the disquiet that had settled over her. The afternoon light angled through the blinds, casting long stripes across the polished oak surface, highlighting the subtle imperfections that came with years of careful use. She poured herself a second cup of tea and listened to the faint rustle of leaves outside, the only movement in the otherwise still house. Every object seemed to take on new significance. The silverware that Edward had polished every weekend, the napkins folded just so, the small vase that held fresh daisies, a reminder of normalcy, of care taken over a life shared. Margaret allowed her thoughts to drift back to earlier in the week, to casual remarks Victoria had made in passing, questions that now seemed loaded with hidden intent, laughter that had felt too sharp in its delivery. She considered the way Edward had smiled, his hand brushing against hers in small, unassuming ways, gestures of affection that now seemed laden with meanings she had not been fully aware of at the time. Margaret examined the photographs again, noticing the faint details she had overlooked previously, the curve of Edward's smile, the casual tilt of Victoria's head, the background that suggested familiarity rather than coincidence. Each detail seemed to reinforce a narrative she had been trying to ignore, an undercurrent of behavior and choice that had quietly accumulated beneath the surface. She moved to the sideboard and picked up a notebook, opening it to a blank page, feeling the need to organize her observations, to give form to the questions and uncertainties that had been circling in her mind. She jotted down times, places, small anomalies she remembered, connecting dots without judgment, simply acknowledging what was present. The quiet allowed her to observe without distraction, to see the subtle interplay of human behavior, the signals that are often unnoticed until carefully considered. Margaret sipped her tea and let her gaze wander to the window, where the sky had begun to shift, the late afternoon lights softening into a cooler hue, the familiar street outside bathed in gentle shadow. She thought of the daily routines she and Edward had maintained, the small rituals that had given her life structure and comfort, and she realized how much she had taken those for granted, assuming constancy in the face of subtle changes. Margaret returned to the living room, arranging the photographs in chronological order, the images now telling a story with a clarity that had been elusive. She noted the gestures, the angles, the context, each a piece of evidence in a silent narrative, and she allowed herself to acknowledge the growing understanding without panic, without anger, only measured observation. The air in the room felt heavier with the weight of realization, and yet Margaret felt a sense of readiness, a quiet determination to approach what lay ahead with composure, to act deliberately rather than react impulsively. She considered the conversations that might follow, the questions she would ask, the moments when silence might speak more effectively than words. The afternoon stretched on, and she allowed herself to remain seated, absorbing the details of the room, the photographs, the light, and the sense of continuity that would guide her through the unfolding events. Margaret understood that careful attention, measured reflection, and deliberate action would serve her far better than hasty confrontation, and she prepared herself, mind and spirit aligned, to navigate the revelations with clarity, patience, and strategic consideration. Margaret walked to the bookshelf and ran her fingers along the spines of well-worn volumes, each book a silent witness to years of quiet life and shared experiences. The photographs still rested on the coffee table, slightly rearranged as she had done several times, each glance revealing new details she had not noticed before. She took a deep breath and allowed herself to recall the mornings she and Edward had spent together, the gentle rituals that had been part of their life. Coffee poured just so, newspapers folded neatly on the armrest, the soft hum of conversation that needed no words. The memories brought a strange comfort, a reminder that beneath the shock and confusion there was still the foundation of years spent in harmony, though now shadowed by uncertainty. Margaret moved to the kitchen to refill her tea, the warm ceramic cup grounding her in the present moment. She watched the steam rise, twisting slowly, and for a moment allowed herself to consider how carefully life had to be observed, how each small gesture carried meaning, and how easily it could be misinterpreted or hidden. She thought of Victoria, the ease with which she had navigated the household, the calculated smiles and light conversations, the subtle way she had inserted herself into routines. The contrast with Edward's steady, thoughtful manner was stark, and Margaret noted it without judgment, cataloging each observation for the clarity it provided. Returning to the living room, she adjusted the photographs, aligning them edge to edge, noticing how the light from the afternoon sun caught on the edges of paper, revealing small nuances she had overlooked before. Each photo told a story, and together they formed a narrative she could not ignore. Margaret allowed herself to feel the full weight of the situation without letting it disrupt her composure. She had learned over the years that control and observation were her greatest tools. She sat on the sofa, crossing her legs and folding her hands, letting her mind trace back to subtle cues. The times Edward had been distracted, Victoria's fleeting comments that now seemed pointed, the small changes in household dynamics that had once appeared inconsequential. These were the building blocks of understanding, and she reviewed them meticulously, noting the patterns, the repetition, the intention implied by consistency. Outside, a breeze shifted the leaves, casting fleeting shadows across the room, momentarily altering the light that fell across her surroundings. Margaret watched, observing the interplay of light and shadow, a metaphor for the truths and deceptions she was unraveling. She considered the next steps with deliberate patience, recognizing that clarity and strategy were essential before any confrontation or conversation. The quiet of the afternoon allowed her thoughts to organize, each memory, observation, and conclusion settling into a coherent framework. Margaret recognized that patience and careful reflection were her allies, that understanding the full scope of what had occurred would enable her to navigate the situation with composure and effectiveness. The photographs, the envelope, the books, and the furniture around her all contributed to a sense of continuity and grounding, reminders of the stability she still maintained amidst the disruption. She sipped her tea, allowing the warmth to steady her thoughts, focusing on the cadence of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary sounds of a household operating as it always had, yet now tinged with the awareness of the underlying narrative. She walked to the sideboard and ran her fingers across the smooth surface, noting the familiar weight of the vase and the slight imperfection at its base, reminders that even the ordinary could carry meaning if observed carefully. Margaret considered the people involved, thinking through their habits, their likely intentions, and the patterns that had emerged over weeks and months, recognizing that consistency in behavior often revealed more than any single event could. Returning to the sofa, she placed the photographs side by side, aligning the edges precisely, examining the details again, the positioning of Edward's hands, the tilt of Victoria's head, the background settings that indicated familiarity rather than casual coincidence. Each observation added another layer to her understanding, not of guilt or blame, but of a reality she could no longer ignore. Margaret allowed her mind to trace potential courses of action, weighing each with measured care, considering timing, context, and the subtleties of conversation that might elicit clarity without unnecessary confrontation. She glanced at the sunlit floorboards, the gentle shadows shifting as the day progressed, feeling the interplay of light and perception, the way observation could illuminate truths hidden in plain sight. The room, the photographs, and the envelope created a constellation of evidence, and Margaret positioned herself as both witness and strategist, integrating memory with observation, allowing each insight to inform the next. She reflected on the patience required, on the slow accumulation of understanding, and the power that came from careful contemplation. Margaret's hands rested lightly on her knees, the tea long since cooled, as she mentally rehearsed questions, anticipated responses, and mapped possible outcomes, understanding that deliberate attention and calm reflection could be far more effective than immediate reaction. The quiet hum of the afternoon persisted, grounding her in the moment, providing space to synthesize what she had learned and to prepare herself for the conversations and decisions that lay ahead. She felt neither haste nor panic, only the clarity that came from measured attention, the knowledge that she could navigate the revelations methodically, guided by observation, patience, and thoughtful strategy. Each small detail in the room, each subtle cue from the photographs, contributed to a framework that Margaret could use to approach the unfolding situation with composure, insight, and deliberate action, ensuring that she remained in control of both her understanding and her responses. Margaret sat back in her chair and allowed her thoughts to settle, feeling the quiet hum of the house envelop her in a steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with the turbulence of her mind. She traced the rim of her teacup with a fingertip, noting the small imperfections in the glaze, each one a reminder that nothing was perfect, yet every flaw held character and history, much like the lives intertwined within her home. She reflected on the subtleties of human behavior, the small gestures that accumulate over time, revealing intentions that are not immediately apparent. Margaret reviewed the sequence of events in her mind, placing each detail within the larger narrative. Edward's distracted smiles, Victoria's carefully timed comments, the subtle shifts in routine that had once seemed inconsequential. She examined the photographs again, this time focusing not on shock or betrayal, but on understanding the patterns of behavior, the interplay between actions and context that had led to this moment of clarity. She moved to the side table and opened her notebook, jotting down observations without judgment, each note a marker of insight and preparation. Margaret considered the conversations that might need to occur, the questions that could elicit understanding, and the timing required to navigate them thoughtfully. The afternoon light changed, softening the edges of the room, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor, reminding her of the passage of time and the continuity of her surroundings amidst the unfolding revelations. She allowed herself to acknowledge the emotions stirred by the photographs, the subtle ache of recognition, and the awareness that careful planning would serve her better than immediate reaction. Margaret took a slow, deliberate breath, appreciating the clarity that patience and observation had provided, and allowed herself to feel the quiet empowerment of having knowledge, of understanding the dynamics at play. She walked slowly to the window, observing the movement of neighbors and the gentle sway of the trees, noting patterns of life continuing outside while she prepared for her own measured actions inside. Every detail contributed to her understanding, every memory layered onto the present, giving depth to her assessment of the situation. Margaret recognized the importance of deliberate action and strategic thought, the power of being fully informed and calmly prepared. She revisited the photographs once more, allowing her eyes to trace lines and positions, noting the subtle cues of familiarity and interaction. She organized her notes, aligning insights with observations, preparing a mental framework for future conversations, aware that measured understanding could shape outcomes far more effectively than impulsive emotion. The quiet of the late afternoon pressed gently against the room, the air carrying a stillness that encouraged reflection, focus, and composure. Margaret considered her next steps with care, each thought deliberate, each plan attentive to nuance and context. She remained seated, centered, observing the room, the photographs, and the light, integrating memory, observation, and insight, allowing the accumulated knowledge to form a foundation for measured, thoughtful action that respected both her own position and the subtle complexities of the people around her. In that stillness, she felt a quiet confidence, the understanding that clarity, patience, and careful attention would guide her through the unfolding circumstances with composure and strategy, ensuring that each move she made was informed, deliberate, and purposeful. Margaret leaned back in the armchair, letting the afternoon sunlight wash over her, illuminating the fine lines of her hands as they rested lightly on the armrests. She allowed herself to follow each thought without interruption, cataloging the interactions, the subtle patterns, the nuances she had observed over days and weeks that now assembled into a clear narrative. She considered Edward's habitual attentions, the rhythm of his daily movements, and the faint inconsistencies that had seemed trivial before, now revealing a subtle divergence from his usual constancy. Margaret picked up the photographs again, examining the small details, the angle of a head, the expression in the eyes, the slight shifts in posture, and noted how context had altered the meaning of gestures she had once interpreted as casual or benign. She moved slowly through the living room, touching familiar objects with intentional mindfulness, feeling the solidity of the furniture, the texture of the rug under her feet, grounding herself in the physical reality of the space even as her mind navigated the intricate web of interpersonal dynamics. Her gaze returned to the window, where the shadows of the maple trees stretched across the lawn, the gentle sway in the breeze creating a rhythm that contrasted with the internal precision she sought in her observations. Margaret considered the patterns of interaction she had witnessed, recalling conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, but now revealed subtle cues of intent and emphasis, small signals that collectively suggested a more complex underlying story. She noted how Victoria's movements in the household had been consistently timed, her comments placed with precision, and her body language carefully managed to convey attentiveness while obscuring certain realities. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest and noticing the soft aroma, a calming anchor against the disquiet of accumulated knowledge. She arranged the photographs in a sequence that highlighted progression, examining the interplay of visual cues, the context of each setting, and the interactions captured, allowing herself to trace patterns of familiarity, intention, and timing. Margaret reflected on the constancy of her own routines, the deliberate care with which she managed her home, and the patience that had always guided her actions, recognizing these qualities as tools that could be employed now to navigate the emerging truths with clarity and composure. She considered potential conversations, evaluating the timing, tone, and phrasing that would allow her to confront questions or confirm insights without unnecessary tension, ensuring that observation and understanding remained at the forefront of any interaction. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the wall clock, and the shifting patterns of light across the floor all contributed to a sense of stillness, a space in which careful reflection could guide measured action. Margaret felt a calm determination settle within her, a steadying awareness that her understanding, patience, and attention to detail afforded her the power to manage unfolding situations thoughtfully. She returned to the sofa, hands folded over her lap, photographs aligned neatly before her, and let the light fall across the pages of her notebook where observations and insights had been recorded. Each note represented a step toward comprehension and preparation, a careful map of behaviors, patterns, and subtle cues she could use to navigate conversations, decisions, and next steps with deliberate intention. The room remained quiet, the interplay of sunlight and shadow emphasizing the contours of familiar objects, and Margaret felt the equilibrium of patience, clarity, and deliberate reflection, readying herself for the unfolding moments with insight, composure, and strategic thought. Margaret shifted in her seat, letting her eyes trace the familiar contours of the living room one more time. The late afternoon sun casting long streaks of gold across the carpet, highlighting the textures of the furniture and the polished surfaces she had maintained for years. She leaned slightly forward, examining the photographs yet again, noting the way light reflected off the glossy paper, emphasizing angles and expressions that had previously seemed trivial, now carrying subtle meaning she could not ignore. Each image offered clues, fragments of intent and behavior that, when observed carefully, revealed a coherent pattern across time and circumstance. She allowed her mind to wander to past interactions, recalling the cadence of Edward's conversations, the pauses, the shifts in tone, the subtle gestures that had hinted at complexity beneath the surface. Margaret reflected on the small routines Victoria had introduced into the household, how she had positioned herself in relation to Edward, the timing of comments and movements, and the consistency with which these patterns had repeated. She sipped her tea, feeling warmth spread through her chest, and let her awareness expand across both the physical space and the mental map she had been constructing, noting how her observations had grown sharper with patience and careful attention. Margaret reached for her notebook and updated her notes, cross-referencing dates, times, and locations captured in the photographs, integrating memory with present observation, creating a mental framework that allowed her to anticipate future interactions with clarity. She considered the potential outcomes of conversations yet to come, planning questions and responses that would elicit information while preserving composure and dignity. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, and the occasional distant sound from the street all contributed to the stillness, reinforcing her focus and providing a rhythm against which she could measure thought and strategy. Margaret examined the subtle details once more, the expressions, the body language, the background elements that suggested familiarity, and recognized that understanding these nuances would be essential to navigating the situation effectively. She allowed herself to feel the quiet authority of preparation, the steadying sense that careful observation and deliberate reflection had provided her with insight, and a measure of control. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, the cup of tea now cooled, as she traced the sequence of events in her mind, each moment aligned with evidence and recollection, allowing a calm comprehension to settle over her. Margaret realized that patience, observation, and attention to detail had placed her in a position of strength, giving her the ability to respond thoughtfully, strategically, and with measured clarity when the time came. She remained seated, poised, attentive to every nuance in the room, letting the patterns, the light, the objects, and her observations coalesce into a cohesive understanding that would guide her through the next steps with insight, composure, and deliberate purpose. Margaret remained seated in the quiet of the living room, the afternoon light now softening toward early evening, filtering through the blinds in long, slanting rays that illuminated the edges of the photographs and the envelope she had examined so carefully. She allowed herself to review each observation once more, tracing the subtle details of posture, expression, and context, building a comprehensive understanding of the unfolding situation. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards as she shifted slightly, and the distant sound of a car passing by outside provided a rhythm against which she could measure her thoughts, giving structure to the careful mapping of behavior and intention she had been constructing. Margaret sipped the last of her tea, feeling the warmth linger in her chest and the subtle aroma of chamomile fill the air, anchoring her as she organized her reflections into a coherent framework. She revisited the sequence of photographs, aligning them chronologically and noting how each moment captured, when placed together, revealed a story that extended beyond any single frame, a narrative of relationships and interactions that required attentive interpretation. Margaret considered the past weeks and months, cataloging the minor irregularities, the casual remarks, and the shifts in routine that now, with perspective, appeared meaningful, and she connected these to the visual evidence before her. She thought through the practical steps she could take, the conversations to be held, the questions to be asked, and the timing necessary to ensure clarity without unnecessary confrontation, understanding that patience and strategic consideration would be her most effective tools. Her gaze drifted around the room, noting the familiar furniture, the polished surfaces, the small personal touches that had always brought comfort, each one a reminder of continuity and stability in a space now charged with the quiet tension of realization. Margaret allowed herself a moment to breathe, to settle into the awareness that observation and reflection had provided insight and clarity, that she was fully informed and capable of navigating the upcoming interactions with composure. She considered the interplay of people, actions, and intentions, understanding the power inherent in thoughtful anticipation, in measuring each step, and in remaining present while observing carefully. The sunlight waned, and the room became a mixture of light and shadow, reinforcing the contrasts she had been tracing, the visible and the hidden, the expressed and the implied. Margaret returned to her notes, reviewing and refining them, each line representing a connection, a question, a pattern discerned, and a plan shaped through patient attention. She felt the quiet authority that comes from understanding, the steadiness that arises from preparation, and the calm confidence that accompanies awareness. Margaret recognized that her next actions, when taken with deliberate care, would allow her to address the situation thoughtfully, to navigate the complexities of relationships with insight, and to respond with clarity and measured composure. She remained poised, attentive, and fully present, letting the environment, the light, the photographs, and her accumulated understanding coalesce into a readiness that was both quiet and resolute, providing her with the grounding and foresight necessary for the conversations and decisions that lay ahead.